Good morning. No, that's not going to do. Good morning. All right, this is an interactive session here. If I'm just up here as the sage on the stage, it's not going to be a success for all of us. So let's make this as interactive as possible. And it is my goal to try to distract you from your distraction machines, otherwise known as your cell phones, and try to keep you engaged in some of the opportunities and challenges for education in the exponential era. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the dynamics that we see in the constant change of how we think about learning and the way that we deliver learning. I want to talk about some of the opportunities to be able to think of work, not just jobs, but work and how it's transitioning, and then some of the ways that we can be continually able to deliver the kinds of services and capabilities that youth and older need to be able to have in this exponentially changing world. So, and then I want to jump as quickly as possible into questions and answers so I can make sure that we're sort of calibrating this around the issues that you care about the most. So bear with me, and let's go back to the time when you were 13. And let's say in some time not too much in the distant future, you wake up in the morning and you put on your augmented reality glasses. And your coach, your artificial intelligent coach, starts to give you suggestions for what you might eat for breakfast that morning. And there's a little bit of gamification in there to try to convince you to eat the thing that's healthier for you. And maybe you'll rack up some points for a video game that you could download later. You also see your schedule popping up on your augmented reality glasses, and it tells you that you're going to be going to visit a park with your class and your teacher. And automatically, an autonomous vehicle, a three-wheeled tuk-tuk, shows up at your house. You hop into it, and it drives you to this park where your teacher and your classmates are waiting. And on the docket for that day, on the schedule, is a talk about civil justice. And so your teacher is going to have a series of conversations with civil leaders throughout history, including Nelson Mandela. And because of your augmented reality glasses, it's as if these leaders are there in front of you, and you're able to interact with them just as you're able to interact with your teacher. Now, you go back to your classroom, and you collaborate with your co-students on a set of problems that each of you is deeply engaged on. For instance, for you, what you care the most about is you've seen a ton of pollution in the rivers and the streams near your home. And so you actually research ways to be able to develop a new kind of bioplastic using banana peels to be able to solve the problem of having too much plastics in our rivers and our streams. And all of these activities, including the process by which the autonomous vehicle shows up at your house, each different activity that you perform, all of the different products that you generate, including all of the writing that you do, all of that is stored on an open ledger called a blockchain. And oh, by the way, one of the things that you do because your teacher did such a great job this morning is you tick a little mark so that a digital coin is added to the purse of that teacher so that in years in the future that will actually augment their income. So every single one of the technologies that I've described, every component, every step that you follow, all of those technologies exist today and are very, very likely to become infused into learning experiences in the future. And so if your sense is that the world is moving faster and faster, that the pace of change is accelerating, that the technologies that are affecting your arena, that are infusing their way into the classroom, that pace of change is accelerating, you're absolutely right. And the way we think about this at Singularity University, where I'm the adjunct chair for the future of work, is to think about what exponential change means and how we can try to get our arms around all of those changes. So I was never very good at math in school. I barely escaped high school. But my memory is that if I took a step that's a meter in distance and then another meter and so on, after 30 steps, I think I've gone 30 meters. But if I take one step and then I take 2 meters and then 4 meters and 8, I double every time. After 30 steps, I'll have gone over 1 billion meters, and I'll have gone around the world 26 times. So that's what exponential change is all about. It's about this curve, this inflection point that we hit as we go along, as technology continues to accelerate the world around us. And as a matter of fact, if we look at human development in history, and by the way, I'll make sure all of these slides are posted on SlideShare on LinkedIn. So you can take as many pictures as you want, but I'll make sure that the slides are available to you as well. If you think of human history, then it's actually, you're right. The pace of change has done nothing but accelerate. In the past 100 years, many of the advances that we think of as technologies that infuse our lives and our businesses today have only appeared in the past few decades. And that pace of change is only increasing. So Singularity University, what we try to do, now unfortunately, it's neither a university nor is it really about the singularity, but why should we be any different? Facebook isn't about trying to find entering freshmen into a college anymore. So what Singularity University is actually a think tank. We have a network of 1,000 adjunct faculty around the world, and we have a network of about 100,000 members, people that have gone through some level of our education programs. And our focus is on trying to help people to understand these exponential technologies and how they're affecting our world. And here's just sort of a set of examples. But you read about all these technologies constantly in the papers. You're inundated by the changes in our world that are coming with technologies, innovators that are creating new products and services that were unimaginable even a few years ago, that are the realm of science fiction. And as a matter of fact, if you take just 4 of these, advances in computer networks, unfortunately, we call it artificial intelligence. It's really machine learning in most cases. Robotics and sensors, and unfortunately what we call the Internet of Things. The Internet has always been about things. There actually were toasters attached to the Internet in the 1970s. But if you take those 4 technologies and you wrap them together, what ends up happening so much in a lot of the ways that exponential technologies interact with each other is they accelerate each other as well. So it's not that all these innovations are happening in their own lanes, they all sort of interact with each other. And if you take those 4 different arenas, we get something that 5 years ago was in the realm of science fiction, and it's autonomous cars and trucks. Have any of you ever ridden an autonomous car? Anybody? It's massively frightening for the first 5 minutes, and it's tremendously dull and boring for the rest of the time, because you realize that most autonomous vehicles drive slower than your grandmother. And so it's actually a safer technology than you might realize. But the jobs, the work that goes along with these exponential technologies that have created these new kinds of science fiction products, we wouldn't have envisioned these 5 years ago. Did we think about how we would train a drone operator for autonomous trucks? Did we think about what the learning would need to happen for a particular engineer that needs to be able to figure out the ways that the LiDAR, the automatic radar that is working in those cars, is sensing people around it? No, we didn't have any sense that those were the things that we were going to have to teach people. And that's only going to continue to increase. The fog in the distance down the road of all of the new technologies, the ways that it's going to affect the world around us and the new work that it's going to create, we can't possibly anticipate all of those. Now, of course, there are always people that are going to try. So the World Economic Forum actually commissioned some artists to take some of the ideas that came out of, as Saladin mentioned, Fourth Industrial Revolution, a lot of the planning that's focused on that arena and trying to understand these seismic changes that are happening to our industries and our economies. And so they envisioned things like, well, we know today that a surgeon can actually manipulate a surgical instrument using gloves and actually perform a surgical procedure halfway around the world. So we know that that exists, so it's very likely we're going to blend that with robotics, and we're going to have remote surgeons in areas that are going to be able to perform surgeries that people today are unable to do. We know that advances in computing, the blockchain, for instance, require huge amounts of computing power, but we don't have enough places to be able to generate that power and to put those computers, which are essentially mini banks. And so, it's very, very likely that we're going to have, potentially even out here in Cape Town Harbor, we're going to have these farms that engineers are going to have to maintain. We know that additive printing, what's often called 3D printing, can actually today be used to print a house. And the first company to do that was actually incubated by Singularity University. It was a bunch of innovators that said, wait a minute, why couldn't we just take this technology and use pre-stressed concrete and print a house? Well, we know that that's actually going to be used in the future to be able to print larger superstructures. And then finally, we know that Elon Musk is absolutely intent on us colonizing Mars. And most of the people that I know that actually understand that arena believe that it's entirely possible in our lifetimes that we're going to be sending people off into space to colonize other worlds. And how could we possibly, as educators, think about what those skill sets are going to need to be? How could there are kids who are in preschool right now that could be colonizing the moon and other worlds. And how could we think about the ways that we need to prepare them? But we have to. And if this isn't science fiction enough, let me give you another example. So there's a marvelous woman. How many of you have heard of One Laptop Per Child? Do you remember that initiative that was to try to put technology in the hands of especially students in developing economies? So this woman, Mary Lou Jepson, she works in a Quonset hut in the Northern Bay and in the Bay Area. She's a good friend. So Mary Lou is an expert on light. And what Mary Lou has done is she has figured out a way to send infrared, not X-rays, which of course have some really negative side effects, but infrared light through our bodies. And she believes that within the next 2 or 3 years, she is going to create a device about the size of a cassette tape. Anybody remember cassette tapes? That attached to a sensor is going to be able to generate a 3-dimensional color view of your body 1 billion times better than an X-ray. That's with a B, 1 billion times better. But that's not the crazy part. What Mary Lou believes she can do is she can create a skull cap attached to that device that will be able to read the human mind. Now, how can it do that? If you go on YouTube, you'll see that there actually was a study that was done at Harvard of a bunch of graduate students lying in MRI machines, and they were shown a picture of a train and then a picture of an elephant and so on. And the computer was trying to guess what they were looking at based on the areas of the brain that it saw lighting up. And you can see the pictures that the computer tried to generate, and it's sort of train-ish or elephant-ish. It's not very good. But imagine having this kind of device in your own home and being able to scan your body on a daily basis, but also think of the advances in psychology and education in being able to read the human mind. Now, I don't know that all of us want to have these in our homes. I don't know if we want our spouses to know what we're actually thinking. Honey, does this make me look fat? I don't think we actually want to be wearing the skull cap at that time. But this type of science fiction advance, this is right around the corner. We're not making these kinds of things up. These are the things that I've got 2,000 science fiction paperbacks in my basement. These are the kinds of things I used to dream about when I was a kid. And we're in that realm. So how do we think about what this means for learning? How do we think about the way that this changes what we do for education? So let's digress a little bit. So my father was a minister in San Francisco who was actually fired. He was a canon pastor at a cathedral as an Episcopalian minister, and his favorite joke was, what do you do with a canon? You fire it. And so he was laid off because of a budget crunch. And he went to the problems that he'd like to solve. He actually ended up working, helping campus ministers who were on college campuses who themselves were being laid off. And he realized there was a problem that he needed to solve in helping them to understand these seismic changes and helping them to be able to figure out ways to be able to find new work. And so he came up with a process. He talked to a lot of people in the around America on job hunting techniques, and he came up with a book called What Color Is Your Parachute, which is today the world's career manual, 10 million copies in print. But what he saw as he was helping people to figure out how to find the kind of work that would most motivate them and energize them, he saw a pattern in people's lives. And he called this the 3 boxes. And he said, so there's this big chunk of learning at the beginning of our lives in the box of education, and then there's this big chunk of work, and then finally in what I call the period formerly known as retirement, there's supposedly a big chunk of leisure that we were all sort of pushing towards. And this model actually was developed when we shifted from, at least in the United States, from an agricultural to an industrial economy. Many Western nations followed this pattern. And we needed to actually produce education in a mass production sort of process. And so this created what my friend Esther Wojcicki, who wrote the book Moonshots on Education, I'll be talking about that in a little bit, called the sage on the stage, the person who is the one at the front, because I needed to get information into the head of a student. That's where we kept information. That's where the books were. The information was in the heads of the teachers. That's where you had to go to get the information. And we left a little bit of it over for libraries. Now, I think of this process of how education helps us in our lives as the game of chutes and ladders, which I used to play with my son. Now that he's 22 years old, we don't play this very often. But the whole idea of the arc of our lives and the way that education can be helpful is there are constant opportunities and challenges. And I don't know if you've ever played this, but basically the idea is that you're rolling the dice every time, just like we do in our lives, and you're moving through this pattern. And every once in a while, you'll hit a chute. That is, it's a big hole in the ground, and you will drop down back where you came from. Now, we all know that there are plenty of these chutes. There are plenty of these holes in our lives. There's tremendous challenges, as Saladin was saying. It's a tremendous number of people who go hungry at night, who don't have roofs over their heads, who have to live in areas with violence, who don't have the religious freedom that they need. And as educators, what we have the opportunity to do is to create the ladders that can actually help them to accelerate. And in a world of exponential change, what those ladders are, how we design those ladders, is increasingly critical, because as Saladin was saying, is we're seeing a huge asymmetry in work markets around the world. That is, there's the work opportunity, and there's workers that could be performing some of that work, but they're not symmetrical. That is, they're not matching up in the way that they need to. So what are some of those challenges? How can we think about the ways to be able to help those students, whether they're 13 or 50 or anything in between, helping them to be able to be prepared for this world of exponential change? So let me give you a couple of examples, a couple of ideas, the insights that we've found through our work with Singularity University and with the Parachute, and then with my consulting company, Charette. So the first is that the mentality has to be, we are all problem solvers. This is the context that we find over and over again is critical when we're talking about trying to empower workers for the work of tomorrow. And let me give you some examples. So one of the programs that I have the most fun doing is we bring people from all over the world to come to Silicon Valley to learn about Silicon Valley style innovation. And one of the groups that we bring is a young set of teenagers from New Zealand, native New Zealanders, Maori kids, many of whom have never seen a city before they came to Auckland to get on the plane to come to Silicon Valley. So you can imagine the mind-blowing responses when they visited places like Google and the design firm IDEO and so on. And there was one young woman, let's call her Mala, who was in the group, and we went through a workshop with them to help them try to understand their own unique skills. And we asked Mala, so can you come up with a problem that you needed to solve? And so the skills that you use to be able to solve that problem. And she said, I have no skills. So, well, no, Mala, that can't be true. We all have skills. We all have these hidden seeds within us. You have to have had some problems that you try to solve. She said, well, yeah, okay, there was some problem last year. I had a friend who lived on an island near me, and I didn't have any other way of going to see her, so I built a canoe. You built a canoe. My wife, who I work with, was actually talking with her in a small group, and she said what do you mean you built a canoe? And she just said, Mala said, I built a canoe. You know, that's what you do. You know, you take a tree and you hollow it out, and of course my wife asked the question I would have asked, which, did it float? And Mala just, of course, looked like it. Well, duh. Yeah, of course it floated. So what you find is that kids need to fall in love with problems to be able to develop the kinds of problem-solving skills that they need to have to be as adaptive as possible. So let me give a couple other examples. So this is Bonke and Sekiwa, one of the programs that we have the pleasure of working with. Google has a program called Science Fair, Google Science Fair, which gives high schoolers around the world the opportunity to find problems that they're really fascinated by and to dive into them and to come up with solutions. So Bonke and Sekiwa, they live in Swaziland. They're at the age of 14. They realized that the ground, the soil, was being played out. So many of the subsistence farmers were getting less and less yield every year. So they literally took their cell phones, they did research online, and they found out that they could do hydroponic gardening They could teach farmers in their area to be able to take literally chicken poop, ferment it, and do hydroponic gardening. They increased yields by 43%, and they reduced the time to market by 30%. 14-year-old kids. A couple of other examples. This is Shrishti. She lives in India, and she saw that there was, I mentioned earlier, the tons of pollution in the rivers and streams near her. She figured out ways to take zinc, just off-the-shelf zinc, and using sunlight to actually remove pollutants from the water in the streams near her, and design it in such a way that it could be done at large scale. And I'll give you the last example. So this is Ann Makazitsky. She's a teenager. She lives in Vancouver, but she has cousins who live in the Philippines. She went to visit her cousins, and she asked them how they were doing in school. And they said, not very well. We can't study at night because we don't have enough money for electricity. And Anne went back home, and she thought, well, wait, why couldn't you just use flashlights? And it turns out, of course, the cost of batteries and so on. So she said, why couldn't you have a flashlight that doesn't need batteries? She did research online, and this, again, age of 14. She came up with a flashlight that is powered by the warmth of the human hand. It's two different types of tiles that, when put together, the differential between them can actually generate an electric current. And we brought her to Google to the science fair, and we had a materials scientist as one of the judges looking at it. And he looked at what she had done, and he said, we missed this. If you had gone to a graduate student and asked them to put these tiles together, they would have told you there's no way that it could generate an electric current. So what we need to do is to give kids the constant opportunity to be able to use those problem-solving skills. Now, why is this important in the context of work? So when we talk about the jobs of tomorrow, I tend to want to unbundle that, to break that apart into its different components and talk about, well, what is it that an employer really wants you to do when they talk about solving problems? So problems that employers want you to solve can be as simple as a dirty floor or as complicated as the strategy for the next product that a company, the next billion-dollar product that a company needs to create. How do we solve problems as humans? We perform tasks. So I've got to go find a broom. And how do we perform those tasks? Well, we use our skills. And we tend to talk a lot about skills without necessarily sort of breaking it down into what they really are. I'll talk about that in just a second. But this is the basic construct of work. You are looking at what work is. Problems to be solved by performing tasks and using our skills. Now, you can't open the paper nowadays without seeing some rhetoric around the loss of jobs in the future. There's this constant talk about there's all these different jobs that are going to go away because of technology. Technology actually doesn't take jobs. What technology does is it automates tasks. So a Roomba performs the same task as a human would. It doesn't mean the human skills aren't necessary. This human has lots of other skills. It could go perform performing other tasks. But if you add them up in aggregate, more and more tasks get performed by technology. So let's talk about those skills. There's research going back to the 1950s by an amazing guy by the name of Sidney Fine. He was actually a sort of honorary uncle of mine. And Sidney ran a project in the United States Department of Labor called the Dictionary of Occupational Titles, which analyzed 26,000 jobs a year and broke down the skills that were used in them. And he kept seeing these patterns over and over again, and he realized there actually are three kinds of skills, and we need to approach them in totally different ways as we try to teach them. So the first one is what he called special knowledges. These are often called rooted or work content skills. These are skills, bodies of information that are sort of rooted into a particular arena. So if you know how to repair a car engine, it's not going to help you all that much when you walk into an operating room to try to do brain surgery. The information is sort of anchored. It's rooted into those areas. There also are these transferable skills. Skills that can be used in a range of different arenas. So if you're good with people, or you're good with physical dexterity, or you're good with using humor, any of those types of skills can be used in a range of different situations. And then finally, the third kind is what we call self-management skills, which we often call traits. And these are often the skills that we use to manage ourselves. So, three kinds of skills. And as educators, what have we done in the past is we've focused deeply on the special knowledges, getting information into people's heads. I know there's going to be a session later on talking about technical and vocational education. That is how we think about the ways that we need to get those special knowledges into people's heads as quickly as possible. And what we've seen as education becomes unbundled, that is, as more and more of educational processes can be broken apart and distributed in different ways, that the speed with which we can help people to learn different topics is actually decreasing. We can help people to gather that information much, much more rapidly. But what we're not doing as much is we're not focusing on those what are often called soft skills, the transferable skills and the traits. And as a matter of fact, we're starting to see the balance of power, the calculus between them shift, because as educators, we're going to find more and more ways to be able to get information into people's heads to help them to learn those rooted or work content skills. And it's these transferable skills that are increasingly going to be more and more critical to help students to be able to perform that work of tomorrow. So what are some of the strategies for how that we have to help students to be able to do this? I am going to posit that there are 4 capabilities that we most have to focus on. Whether the worker of tomorrow is young or old, rich or poor, there are 4 characteristics, there are 4 transferable skills that we absolutely need to help to teach them. So, problem solvers who are adaptive and creative with empathy. Let me explain each of those. And by the way, I hate these, you come up with these things that have acronyms, but it just so happens that I talked about the pace of change, it just so happens that there's an acronym hiding in there. So, problem solvers. I talked about the reason that we have to think of ourselves as problem solvers. We have to think of ourselves as people who dynamically bind around problems to solve. We have to think of ourselves as people who fall in love with problems to solve. Adaptive. The pace of change is not going to slow down. As a matter of fact, it's exponential. It's increasing. And all of those exponential technologies are going to continue that pace of change to keep on moving. Creative. We have to be more creative in the way that we think about the problem-solving process. If we're simply using more mechanical approaches, more mechanical processes to be able to break down tasks and so on, that's the realm of software and robots. Increasingly, innovators out there are going to be using software and robots to be able to perform those tasks. And then finally, I say empathy. And the reason for that is because we have to be more empathic about the problems of the people that we're trying to solve, or the particular systems that we're trying to be able to solve. And so the reason for each of these as transferable skills is that they play together with each other. So let me give you a couple of examples. And some of the strategies that we need to focus on. So the first is that we need to use technologies. We need to figure out ways to be able to leverage these exponential technologies to enhance the skills of teachers. So on the way here, I met with Brett Wigdorts, who's the founder of Teach First in the UK. And I asked him, so what are you seeing in terms of some of the challenges for helping teachers to be able to teach math, for instance? Are there enough really great math teachers in countries around the world? And he said no. He's asked this question over and over and over again, and what he finds is that in most school systems, there simply aren't enough teachers that are going to be able to help students to be able to solve the deepest math problems, to be able to become deeply knowledgeable in mathematics. And so he said, what we need to do is we need to figure out ways to be able to give teachers superpowers, to be able to give them the adaptive skills, to be able to help them to be better at delivering their teaching methods. And because there simply aren't going to be enough great teachers that are going to be able to prepare those students of tomorrow. So we also need to help administrators of schools to become the greatest leaders that they possibly can be. And again, technology can help us, can be able to give those teachers the capabilities, the administrators the kind of superpowers that they need. So speaking of superpowers, so I'm going to stop there because I've been talking a lot about skills and transferability and so on. And so I've got an exercise for you. So you're all people, educators or administrators or people who are focused on the educational system. So I've got an exercise. So I'm going to ask you to turn to the person next to you. Not yet. I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself. Say where you grew up. Not where you are now, but where you grew up. And then I want you to tell the person next to you what you think your superpower is. What's the transferable skill that you believe is your superpower when you go to solve problems? So I want the first person that you're going to do this in pairs. I want the first person to say it, and then I want you to switch and the second person to do it, okay? So now no person left behind. So if you don't have somebody to pair up with, just look at the person next to you. If you don't have somebody, raise your hand. I want you to turn around and find somebody else to talk to. Nobody can sit by themselves. Okay, so this is your exercise, all right? Go. Whew. All right, if you haven't switched already, switch and have the second person talk. All right, try to wrap up. All right, I'm going to stop you there. Shh. Come back to the light. Come back to the light. All right, so give me some examples. What were some of your superpowers? What do you think were some of your strongest? No, let's not be shy. Go ahead. Sorry? Logistics. Okay, great. Another one. Another skill. Sorry? Time management. Excellent. Much better than me at that. Another one. Empathy. Excellent. Another one. Creativity. Creativity, again. Wonderful. Others. Sustainability. Excellent. Yes. Sorry? Resources. Okay, great. All of us have these skills. All of us have these superpowers. And we're all trial and error machines. And what we do is we practice these skills. We find that there are these undiscovered seeds within us, and we find that there is fertile ground, and we tend to practice them and again and hone them because we keep on finding the kinds of problems that we are optimized to solve. So what we need to do is we need to provide educators with that same capability of understanding their superpowers, but then giving them the kinds of support that allow them to be able to deliver the best possible value. And what we're going to find is that there are many subjects, especially those that require repetition and rote learning, that we're going to increasingly need to have technology help us do so that the teacher can move from that sage on the stage, the one that is always the source of that information, to what my friend Esther Wojcicki calls the guide on the side. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in just a second. All right. Another absolutely critical capability is that we know that youth today are digital natives, but all kids, maybe not quite this young, but all kids need to be exposed to digital skills, because increasingly what we're seeing in the workplace is that there's a baseline knowledge of using technology that is only going to increase. And as a matter of fact, technology won't just be the tools that you're using. Technology will increasingly be the partner that you're using. So in the same way that that kid that we were talking about earlier had a virtual reality guide that was giving him advice and giving him input and suggesting to him things that he might learn, we're going to be partnering with technology increasingly. Some of it through these distraction machines, but others through a range of different inputs. And without having kids have access to even some of the most basic technologies, they won't be prepared for the work environment. Third, we need to think of kids as being problem-solving machines, but we need to give them the environments where they can do it. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the maker movement. So my friend Dale Doherty created a magazine called Make, and there are now maker camps, there are maker fairs all over the world. The basic idea is not that everybody needs to become an engineer and create things in a shop. It's much more that we need to give students the opportunity to be able to take chances. We need them to be able to take risks. We need them to allow them to fail. We need to allow them to make mistakes. They don't call it trial and success. They call it trial and error for a reason, because we're trial and error machines, and we will continually develop a better understanding of our skills, and especially our transferable skills, if we're given environments where we can take risks, where we can experiment, where we can play. Fourth, collaboration. What we've seen over and over again is that students that are learning in silos, they're learning in their own paths, are far less prepared for a work world where they will be collaborating. One of the most consistent trends that we're seeing in the world of work is that teams, distributed virtual teams are collaborating remotely, spread all around the world. And that skill set of being able to actually solve problems collaboratively is increasingly critical. And if we don't give kids that opportunity in class, in school, in their learning environments, to do that kind of collaboration, then they're going to be extremely limited. And fifth, and if I'm going to point to anything that matters the most, it's this model. So if there's one picture you want, it's to understand this is actually what a job is. This is both the set of characteristics of you, each one of you, every single one of you, and of the work that you do. Not only are there the transferable skills that you use and the knowledges that I was talking about, but there are particular kinds of people you are optimized to want to be around, to want to collaborate with in a range of different environments. There are particular characteristics of the workplace that you're in that are optimized for the way that you work best. Some of us like to have plenty of light. Some of us want to be troglodytes inside a dark room. There's certain levels of compensation, ways that you want to be rewarded for the kind of work that you do. There are certain places geographically that you want to do, and increasingly, as I said, that's going to be distributed. You might be doing remote work. And then finally, center of the target is the purpose, is the set of values that define your work. These are truisms about us as individuals. And the process by which each of us and each of our students go through understanding what is optimized for each of them, what makes them want to be able to use these particular skills, the skills that they most love, work around these kinds of people. That self-inventory process, that self-knowledge process is absolutely critical in a world of exponential change. Without that capability, without the knowledge of what drives you, you will not be driven to continually go and solve the problems of tomorrow. The passive model of staying in place, one person, one job, long time in a particular job, that model is starting to erode. And it won't go away completely, but there will be fewer and fewer jobs that have that kind of characteristic. So, for those of you who are focused on policy, let me just hit a couple of high-level things, and then try to bring this to the finish line. So what is it, how can a range of economies and systems that are going through the kinds of challenges that Saladin was talking about from a policy standpoint, how can we think about the ways that they can be better at the delivery of next generation learning systems? So the first that we've seen is that every economy, every country, every community needs to have a set of processes by which that community is continually agreeing as to what it is it's best at solving, the kinds of problems that it's most optimized for. There's an amazing group called the Collective Innovation that's based in that's tiny little town called Coeur d'Alene in Idaho, which is one of the most remote areas of the United States, that has set itself up, taken this small town of 30,000 people, and decided that what they were most optimized for was to become a hub of robotics and AI programming. And in 3 years, an entrepreneur by the name of Nick Smoot has done exactly that. Brought this town together. They agreed that they were going to become this hub of innovation, focused specifically on these kinds of programmers. And I just visited there a couple weeks ago, and it's amazing. They're 15-year-old kids that can tell me more about AI than some of the greatest experts in Silicon Valley. In China, there's something called Taobao villages. These are villages that were left off the grid that had no way to be able to create economic value. They were just eroding. The kids were moving away to the cities. These towns got together, and they agreed that they were the town that was best at furniture, the town that was best at Christmas ornaments. And they developed a brand specifically for that, and using Taobao, which is sort of China's version of eBay, we're able to create tremendous economic viability. And as a matter of fact, the village that makes furniture, because there were so many people that were buying Rolls Royces in the town, they actually had to build a road that got them to the major highway. And so you need this thesis as to how communities can continually pull together, and as educators, the thesis for what you believe your contribution to your ecosystem, the way that you're going to be able to continue to help people to be able to thrive. Argentina, for instance, there's a national plan to basically take the classroom and flip it and build it much more like the sort of maker studio and try to make it much more of an innovation model. And we're starting to see this type of approach where educators are getting together and saying, wait a minute, this is the model by which we are going to help to prepare people for the work of tomorrow. There's a tremendous school in Tel Aviv, in Israel, called Bialik Rogozin. It was actually the subject of an Academy Award-winning documentary. And this is a school that made a commitment to being the complete nurturing environment for its students, many of whom, virtually all of whom, were refugees, 800 refugees that came from all over the Middle East. And it's created this tremendous platform for high academic standards that didn't exist before. We're seeing countries that are starting to experiment in ways that they can leapfrog with technology to be able to provide the kinds of amazing next generation capabilities leveraging new technologies. So for instance, this is in Norway. Rather than having to build, if you're going to build a college, let's say, to focus on training aerospace engineers and having to build a whole bunch of aerospace equipment, instead you can use augmented reality and virtual reality headsets, and you can actually create a virtual environment without having to have these engines in hand. And then finally, networks. I know that one of the sessions a little later is going to be on the new talent marketplaces. So what we're seeing is that the friction in the connection between different markets on a global basis is reducing. There's never been a time in human history where you have the capability to be able to link between different innovators or different producers in different parts of the world and to create new economic value. And let me give you an example. So there's a woman, we'll call her Elsa, who was married. She had an undergraduate degree. She lived in the Bay Area. She had a young daughter, but she was in an abusive relationship. She lost her job. She moved into a shelter. And she was found by this tremendous woman by the name of Carmel Judd, who has an organization, a nonprofit called Rising International. What Carmel did was she helped Elsa, put her through a bunch of training, and then what Rising does is it takes women in developing economies, in this case in Afghanistan, who themselves were the subject of abusive relationships or were in human trafficking situations, teaches them a craft, and then women like Ilsa in the United States sell those same crafts in home sales lunches. Ilsa now had gone back for her graduate degree and is working at a very well-known tech company in the Bay Area. So you're seeing examples of how these nascent networks can create tremendous economic value by linking people around the world. Now, how can we think about the ways that we're going to be able to take our educational systems and supercharge them to be able to support these kinds of new capabilities? So there's a man by the name of Dwight David Eisenhower, who was a military leader in the United States, and he had what I feel is the kind of mentality that we need to be thinking about. What he said was that if you're focusing on a problem, in this case we're thinking about how are we going to create those, what was the phrase again? What does PACE stand for? Problem solvers who are adaptive and creative with empathy. Now some might want to substitute enterprising or entrepreneurial, but how are we going to create those PACE students of tomorrow? And what Eisenhower said is if you find a problem that you cannot solve, then you have to enlarge it. So let's think about how we enlarge this problem. How do we create this as a moonshot kind of context for ourselves? So I mentioned Moonshots in Education. This is a book I'd highly recommend. Esther Wojcicki is not only this amazing educator in Palo Alto, California, but she happens, there are 3 daughters. One is a tremendous genetics researcher at UCSF. One of them runs YouTube, and one started a company called 23andMe. So she's also writing a book on parenting, thank God, because we can all use the help. But basically what she said was that we need to think in terms of moonshots. We need to think in terms of setting extraordinarily high goals and ways of helping our students and ourselves, our own businesses, to be able to think bigger, to be able to come up with newer solutions that are huge. So one example, many of you may have heard of the X Prize Foundation, co-founded by Peter Diamandis, who also co-founded Singularity University. So this is, I encourage you to go take a look at xprize.org, but there is an educational moonshot which is intended to help children to empower themselves to take control of their own learning. And there actually is a half a dozen finalists now in this competition. I strongly urge you to take a look at this because what it allows us to do is to set these extraordinarily high goals, to develop bigger visions of the things that we can do, the kinds of opportunities that we can have to be able to take big steps to be able to solve some of the biggest challenges. And today, education obviously is one of those challenges. So we're going to do another quick exercise, and then I'm going to wrap up and we can ask questions. So I'm going to ask you to turn once more to the person next to you. Hopefully find a different partner. And so what I want you to do is I want you to think for about 10 seconds. If I gave you a magic wand and you could solve one huge problem related to education and the jobs of tomorrow, what would that solution be? You have a magic wand, and you can wave it and come up with a solution that's going to solve the problem you think is the most critical in this arena. What would it be? So I want you to partner once more. I want you to, the first person, throw out an idea. It doesn't matter how wild and crazy it is. The crazier the better. The bigger the better. And then you can flip. Give it a shot. Okay, if you haven't flipped already, now the second person. Talk about your idea. All right, I'm going to ask you to stop there. Okay, come back to the light. Shh. All right, I'm sure there's some wild and crazy ideas out there. Give me one, please. An idea, yes. Eliminate schools. I love it. All right. I want to hear more about that. Another idea. Sorry? Yes. Educate the teachers. Sorry? Re-educate the teachers. Absolutely. Another one, way back there. Shout it out, please. Customization, mass customization, I'm going to assume, right? Yes. Absolutely. So one more time. I didn't. Attract more youth to vocational education. Absolutely. Okay. So you're going to be going through a series of sessions through the rest of the event. Only moonshot thinking need apply. Incremental innovation is great, but you're among some of your most tremendous peers from around the world. Here is your chance to be able to come up with the big ideas and to be thinking about the ways to actually make those big ideas happen. At these points in our history, I mean, why are we all here? Why are we here at this particular time? I'm going to posit it's because the pace of change, exponential change, is actually taking off. And we are all here because we are the ones that are going to help current and future generations to be able to take advantage of it. It's not a matter of thinking of this as just a series of disruptions that's going to simply affect a range of populations. We have to think of this as a market shift. Our economies are going to operate as what I call digital work economies. We're starting to see so many of the characteristics of them. If we think of that as a set of positive changes that we can actually have an impact on, if we can be empowered to help others to be able to find their own superpowers. I'm going to jump ahead here really quickly. To find their own superpowers. There we go. If we can help the youth of today, the adults of today, to understand their own skills, to be better at being able to find the kinds of problems that they most love to solve, then we're going to have an exponential future. We're going to have that capability. We're going to come up with technologies that are going to not replace humans, but are going to enhance humans, that are going to help us to be able to accomplish challenges that we've never been able to accomplish before. And ultimately, we're going to help people to find the seeds within them, those skills, those nascent skills. We're going to be able to, as educators, shine sunlight on them to be able to find their own paths, to be able to create their own paths, not just find work in the future, but to be able to create it, so that they can be doing the work that they are most meant to do. And so my charge to you, and I think it echoes what Saladin was saying, is no human left behind. No person left behind. That's really what we need to be thinking about as educators. We need to be thinking about the ladders that we are creating to help people to be able to continually move up to the next level in their lives and in their economies. I'm going to be asking you for questions in just a second, but think of it not just as ladders, but as a jungle gym, of thinking of ways to be able to help people to find their own superpowers, to be able to continually float, to create, to solve new problems, to be able to create new solutions, and ultimately to create their own moonshots. Thank you. All right, so we've got about 10 minutes left. So what have I not covered? Now this is like that awkward period in a date where, you know, the conversation has a little bit of a lull, and then you find the new thing, and now you're off to the races. So please, Doug, we've got some microphones here, so it really helps if you, unless it's really short. Yeah, I guess there's one microphone over here. Oh, okay, I'm sorry. Yeah, go ahead. Okay, I'm sorry. Yeah, there they are. Yeah. Yeah, you had your head up first, please.
Yeah. So can
you just tell me your name, please?
Ninad Karpe from AppTech India.
Okay, great.
So you alluded to teachers, and I want to push you further on that.
Yes.
So there are two scenarios sometimes people paint. One is that teachers will not be required at all. It will just be collaborative learning and robotics and all that. On the other side, extreme, people talk about teachers with far better teachers, because you spoke also about kids requiring better work skills and life skills. Where do you see the scenario going? Will eliminate teachers or better teachers?
Okay, so we're gonna if we're gonna eliminate schools, we might as well eliminate teachers too, right? I don't have the Solomon answer, because I don't think there's one monolithic answer. So what I do believe is that there are a number of activities that teachers have to perform. It's a job that requires just Herculean capabilities, and that we need to think of ways to be able to take the parts of that job away that are the most challenging and don't actually provide the kind of value that we want our teachers to do. At the end of the day, don't we all want the teachers to be able to help individual learners to be able to get over humps and to be able to learn something new that is absolutely useful to them, and not to be doing so many of the mundane things or the repetitive things that technology can support. So I want to point back to what I said Esther Wojcicki talks about, which is the guide on the side. We've put this huge weight on the shoulders of teachers that they have to be knowledgeable, so deeply knowledgeable about their fields, and yet the world is constantly changing. So what I want to posit is that we can actually focus on the needs of that teacher and the ways that they are working with their students to continually help them to optimize themselves. And there are some that are just absolutely born teachers that are the ones that should be continually working with an entire class and are able to juggle all of those different needs, but that's not every teacher. And so we need to figure out ways to be able to upskill the average teacher so that they can all have superpowers. They can all be that brilliant teacher we want them to be. Another question. Yeah, there's a hand over here. Do you mind just grab it? Just walk up to the mics, folks. You don't have to ask me.
Okay, my name is Evans from Ghana, and I want to ask a question about changes that you talked about. You see, basically we want to adapt quickly, but these changes also change quickly, and it comes with a financial cost. So I adapt to maybe this machine, and within 3 years I would have to change it. The financial cost involved. So my question is really two here. We have what we call the managerial or the entrepreneurial dilemma. So the dilemma here is this: when do I keep the status quo, and when do I venture into entrepreneurial opportunities? Thank you.
Okay. So in a world where the pace of change, when nothing is certain but the pace of change, things are going to continue to be different than the way we woke up yesterday. What we found is that you can basically break it down to an oversimplification. That's a growth versus a fixed mindset. So there's a psychologist by the name of Carol Dweck. You may have read her work, and I mentioned this in a couple of the courses that I've got on LinkedIn on the future of learning. Essentially what happens is we as humans, we're very contextual, but under a lot of circumstances we have a style by which we approach change. And that is that we are often either biased towards we love the way it is today and we're not absolutely thrilled about the way things are changing. And that often is associated with a more conservative mindset, but let's just say it's fixed. That is, we all are sort of who we are, and we can't really grow and change. That's a fixed mindset. And then the growth mindset says, well, no, actually, the world is changing constantly. I am changing constantly as a person. The work that I'm doing is changing constantly. And with all of that change, I need to have the mentality that we're growing. And we're all going to be better people, better humans tomorrow. And so my response to your question is, you want to encourage people as much as possible to try to shift towards a growth mindset. That is, to continually adapt, to embrace change, not to completely throw away the systems of yesterday, not to completely ignore the way that things are done today, but instead to understand that the anchoring in those particular ways that things have been done before. So I call them, for instance, the old rules of work. One person, one job, very steady state in the same work for a long period of time. That just will be a use case. That, in fact, the job itself is kind of a use case. It's one way to work that will just be decreasingly common. And so you want to honor the past, and especially the anchors that give us cultural rooting and that make us connected to each other. But we need to, as much as possible, encourage people to have this adaptive mindset and that we're all growing and changing people. And that's the only way that we've seen that people are able to continually adapt. It's the only way that we get this kind of mentality that I was talking about with PACE, is the problem solvers who are adaptive and creative and have empathy towards the kinds of problems that they're trying to solve. That will typically be anchored in a growth mindset because it works under the assumption that we're all changing and developing as human beings, and that's the way that we're going to be able to be the most successful in the future. And with that, I think we're just about out of time. So, oh, sorry, one more question here, please. Okay, here's one. Please.
So
Yeah,
thank
go
you
on.
for a very, I'm Anandi Rajakumar and I work at the IFC, so thank you for a very thought-provoking launch to this 2 days. I was thinking about what you said about the 3 types of education and how we apply that as we think about especially emerging markets.
Okay.
So that specialized knowledge, the transferable skills versus the traits.
Right.
Do you see that as a trade-off? And as we think about, what do we need in terms of jobs? The specialized knowledge versus the transferable skills, or do you see that, how do you see how we allocate resources and think about education in emerging markets?
Okay, so good question. So these things are always balances and they're always a trade-offs because there's only so many hours in a day. So the transferable skills, these are the ones that are often the ones that are going to allow people to continually adapt to new situations. So it's critical for us to help students to identify those transferable skills and to hone and develop them. The special knowledges, what we're finding is that it's really, really critical that students have the opportunity to dive deeply into some subject, to feel that they have some place to stand on a particular topic. And so IBM has something called T-skills. I don't know if you've read about this, but the mentality is that the upright of the T is that you got deep into something. You're not just a generalist sort of bouncing around between a range of different topics, but you've got at least one area that you're really, really deep. And so this is what you talk about the trade-offs. This is what we suggest is that students be given the opportunity to be able to dive deeply, to be encouraged to try to become as expert as possible. I don't know if I'd buy Malcolm Gladwell's 10,000 hours investment, but certainly to be able to become very, very deep on something, but to continually remain curious and open to the range of different opportunities to learn. And it's increasingly where we're seeing work being created is at the intersection of things. So I'll give you a quick example, and then I think we have to wrap up. So my son is 22 years old, about to graduate from a college in Ohio, and he's fascinated by writing, by drones, by video production, by archaeology, and I add up all of those things. So he's deep on archaeology, that's what he's been studying, but he's fascinated by all these other areas. And at the intersection, he's probably a science communicator. And that's probably one of the things that he's most optimized to do. And so that's what I talk about in terms of the trade-offs, is we need to give students the opportunity to get deep on something. And as I said, increasingly, that will be shorter and shorter time frames. Coursera, the startup in the Bay Area, has something called nano degrees. And if you haven't studied this, it's really important to understand them. They've taken a half a dozen jobs with an AT&T and broken them down into a course that can be taught in as little as 3 months. Students take that course and they are either hired by AT&T at the end of the course or they're given their money back. That mentality of just-in-time learning, we've already talked about lifelong learning, just-in-time learning is going to be increasingly a mentality I think that's going to be most useful in developing markets, where we try to compress the amount of time that's necessary for somebody to get it deeply up to speed on something, but continually remain curious about a range of other opportunities. So, and with that, I think we're going to wrap up. Thank you.